So hello and welcome to the 18th episode of our podcast, Religion and Praxis. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Tobias Cremer, who is a junior research fellow at Oxford. His extensive research spans across Western societies, exploring the relationship between religion, populism, and right-wing identity politics. With an impressive academic background, including his PhD in politics and international relations from the University of Cambridge, MPP from Harvard Kennedy School, MPhil from Cambridge, a BA from Sciences Po. Dr. Cremer brings a wealth of expertise to our discussion today. In this episode, we'll delve deeper into his latest book, which I was fortunate to read, called The Godless Crusade Religion, Populism, and the Right-Wing Identity Politics in the West. This is published by Cambridge University Press. So join us for engaging and thought-provoking discussion with Dr. Cremer as we examine the intricate connections between religion, politics, and identity in today's world. Welcome to our podcast, Tobias.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So we start with a general set of questions that will kind of guide and shape our conversation before going into specifics. So how has the relationship between religion, populism, and right-wing identity politics evolved in recent years, and what are the key factors driving this change?
Yeah, I mean it's a big argument, so I'll try to keep it very short. But basically, what has been really interesting over the last few years is that we've really been seeing two main developments in Western societies. On the one hand, really the surge of right-wing populist movements that are in many ways not marginal anymore. I mean, they're winning elections, they're forming governments. So you see that, and you see that across many Western democracies at the moment. And then on the other hand, and in some ways parallel, if you look at it chronologically, we see the resurgence of references to religion, especially by these movements. I mean, we all know Donald Trump and his very outspoken use of references to Christianity, saying with the Bible in front of the church during the Black Lives Matter protests, and really casting himself as the defender of Christian America. But that is something we also see in Europe, which in some ways is perhaps more surprising because it's so much more secular. But the French Rassemblement National is still maintaining its big demonstrations and marches in the favor of Joan of Arc, the Catholic saint, and really talking about France's Catholic identity. In Germany, you have Pegida, or the AfD party, also carrying oversized crosses at their protests, and really stylizing themselves as the defenders of the Judeo-Christian West, specifically against a perceived onslaught of Islam, in their words. And that is really something we can see across the board, from the Netherlands to Sweden to Italy and Portugal. So I've really been looking at that, and there's of course a big temptation, and I think a lot of the literature and what you see on the news would suggest that they come together. They're really just one the same reactionary backlash against secular, liberal, and multicultural society. But what has been interesting as I did this research was really to find out that the relationship is often much more complicated, and that actually a key argument that I'm making in the book is that whilst we might think this is a resurgence of religion, in many ways this is much more part of secularization, even a secularization of the concept of religious symbols itself. And just to unpack that a bit, you can see that if you look to Europe, for instance, if you look at voting behavior, for instance, right-wing populist parties actually tend to do best among irreligious voters. So if you look to Germany, The AfD on average scores double as well among irreligious voters than they do among Protestants and Catholics. As you mentioned, a lot of my research has also consisted of conducting interviews with right-wing populist leaders and faith leaders. And it's really interesting that if you ask right-wing populist leaders what they actually mean when they talk about Christian identity, they're very open about saying, "Oh, no, this is not about faith or theology. This is really about." A lot of them even say that, of course, we're atheists, but this is about defending our civilization and about defending our nation and identity against the threat of Islam or the external other. In many ways, religion here becomes primarily a national identity marker. It becomes quite secular, and in some ways, this is really dissociated from Christian practice, Christian faith, and Christian institutions, and people will be quite outspoken about that. So this is basically what I was looking at in the book, like the question of what is driving right-wing identity politics, what is driving their references to religion in that context, and then also looking at how faith communities are reacting to that differently in different countries. And then finally, and we can get into that, but also what role can actually, on the one hand, faith leaders play in that context, but also policymakers and political parties. So that was really my ambition to do that with the book.
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox in your research, and the book looks at the role of Christianity as cultural identity marker in the right-wing populist movements, but there's also this kind of the ambiguity that on the one hand, as you just mentioned, that there are parties which emphasize on Christian identity so much, and yet they appeal to irreligious voters. So how do you explain this in terms of what kind of phenomenon we are dealing with?
Yeah. So I think in order to understand that, and this is why this was basically the first big question that I'm trying to look at, is what actually drives right-wing identity politics? What drives right-wing populism? Why are these parties surging at the moment? What is the deeper underlying development that is common to many Western societies? Why is this happening right now in so many different countries? Because I actually would make the argument that this is not something specific to one or two specific countries. This is what we usually get in the news, but that there's a broader development in Western societies. And basically, my key argument is that, and there's not just mine, there's a lot of literature about that, but that we are basically seeing reorganization of the Western, like American and Western European social cleavage system. So basically, social cleavages are the main divides within a society that really shape the political landscape and the parties that populate it. And historically, we've often said that our cleavage system basically boils down to two main cleavages. On the one hand, the economic cleavage, so to speak, between workers and capitalists, or between open market and a more closed protectionist market. And then on the other hand, the really traditional social and moral cleavage, the religious cleavage between secular liberals on the one hand, and then more socially, often religiously conservatives on the other hand. So if you want to put in these words, the class struggle and the culture wars, the religious culture wars, and this has historically been dominating our societies. But what we are seeing more and more over the last few years is that, especially when you look at right-wing populist parties, they're really not focusing on these issues anymore. They don't really focus on the economics. You can see them actually fluctuate between some you have the Tea Party that is like super pro free market, etc. But then if you look at Trump's policy, it's much more protectionist, and we can see that in Europe as well. So a lot of parties, even the same parties, often fluctuating. And again, on the other hand, it's been really interesting that you can see that also on the social and moral issues, where on the one hand, they would say we are the defenders of the Christian West, but then you see also many parties, especially Europe, where Geert Wilders will say we are the real defenders of gay rights against against Islam, against reactionary religion, or in France, the Front National or the Rassemblement National will say we are the real defenders against of laicite, of the separation of church and state, or of women's rights, etc., etc. So even taking up progressive bits. Again, whether you want to buy that and think this is super authentic is a different question, but there's a lot of flexibility on that, which really suggests that the key policy issue, the core question that right-wing populism is about, is a new social cleavage, a new what I called an identity cleavage in our societies that is much less about issues like abortion or gay marriage, or about taxes and minimum wage, than it is about a much more fundamental question of how to define the us and how to define the other in increasingly individualized, secularized societies. And that this cleavage basically divides society into two big camps, between, on the one hand, a much more globalist, cosmopolitan idea of identity that focuses on group identities primarily for minorities, but tries to transcend group identities for the majority population. And then on the other hand, a much more communitarian camp that really focuses on traditional forms of identity coming from language, nationality, ethnicity, etc. There's obviously, as I say, I'm not the first one talking about that. In Britain, people will know about David Goodhart, who talked about the divide between somewheres and anywheres, and others talk about globalists versus nationalists. That there's a lot of different vocabulary for that, but really this new divide about identity, I think, that the core of this, and this is really what's driving right-wing populism. And the question is then, how obviously does religion come into that? But as we say in this context, it's religion matters much less as a faith. It's much more about finding ways of defining the us against the other. It's much more tribalistic in a way. And it's really interesting if you then see the references. So as I mentioned, I asked one thing I asked right-wing populists is what does Christian identity mean? It was interesting that when I asked this question in comparison to say social democrats or Christian democrats or Democrat, in the Democratic Party, other politicians as well as clergy, they would start talking about theology. They would start talking about the Trinity, the resurrection, the second coming of Christ, whatever. When I asked the same question, right-wing populist leaders, they would start talking about history. They would start talking about geography. They would start talking about identity. And really strikingly, almost all of them would also start talking about Islam in the definition of Christianity. They would say, we are Christian because we have a church in the village and not a mosque. We are Christian because we have Christmas off and we don't celebrate Ramadan. In many ways, we are Christian in some ways because we aren't Muslim. So it's really this trying to define the other, the external other, and ex negativo, then Christianity, or rather Christendom, becomes part of the definition of the us.
Yeah, I think in the context of Western Europe, where right-wing populists consistently underperform among Christian voters, how do you reconcile the existence of what you call religious vaccination effect with the high level of support for right-wing populists among religious voters in other regions? And what is the general, maybe give us the broader sort of picture distinction between these countries and how the right-wing populists perform in the cases which you analyze? What is the key differences and key similarities?
Yeah. I mean, we obviously see, as you say, a lot of variation when we look at the electoral effect or the electoral performance of right-wing populists in different countries. As you said, in Europe, we see this religious vaccination effect in many ways that right-wing populists actually do best, even with the religious rhetoric, among more secular voters than among religious voters. In the US, of course, you see overwhelming support, also among the most religious, for Donald Trump. There are fantastic books about that. Taking America Back for God by Sam Perry, Andrew Whitehead, for instance, will be known to many of your listeners, whereas really the idea that white Christian nationalism is a key driver for, or key driver of Donald Trump's success, and I think it's really important to note that is really important and true, that Trump did perform so extremely well among not just white evangelicals but also Catholics and mainline Protestants, both in 2016 and 2020. But this notwithstanding, I would say that even in the United States, we can actually see that there's an important shift on the American right. So in some ways, I would actually argue that rather than this being the resurgence of a religious right and a strengthening of, resurgence of religion and politics, dystopia of Handmaid's Tale, that in many ways we are rather seeing a secularization of what used to be the religious right. So if you look a bit more closely at Donald Trump's performance, especially in 2016, during the primaries, we could see that initially there was also somewhat of a religious vaccination effect, because Donald Trump, during the primaries, the Republican primaries, actually did best among those Republicans who never attend church, whereas he significantly underperformed among frequent churchgoers. And you can also see that is something that, like religious practice, for instance, in the United States is still correlated with often more open attitudes towards race and immigration, which is really interesting. So the question is, of course, like, why do these voters then rally behind Trump so strongly? Now, it's undeniable that he does extremely well also among very frequent churchgoers. And I think one key question here is, on the one hand, that there has been what one interviewee called a Faustian bargain or transactional bargain between the religious right and the secular right in the United States, that in many ways the religious right has said, okay, Donald Trump might not be our man initially. He comes from a secular right, and there's actually, if you look at Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, like all the people who are really the drivers behind Trump initially, if you talk to them, if you look more closely into their intellectual build-up, it's a much more secular right. In many ways, it's Europeanization of the American right there, because they will talk about European secular scholars of identity politics much more than being influenced by, say, traditional conservative evangelical authors. But what is interesting is that in the United States you have some sort of coalition between this new populist secular right and then the traditional religious right, and I think there are several reasons for that. I think a lot of it is structural. One explanation was, for instance, that I saw in Europe as compared to the United States, is that you have, in many ways, let's put it like this, other way around. The European vaccination effect against the populist right is in many ways not necessarily because Europeans are, better Christians or just like more open towards immigration. In terms of attitudes, there's actually not much of a difference. But one big factor is that these voters, the Christian voters, have traditionally been associated with Christian parties or conservative parties, because they've been, if you think about what I mentioned before, the traditional religious cleavage. So they would be associated with conservative parties in France, or the Christian Democrats in Europe, or historically the GOP in the United States. And one finding is that wherever such an alternative, Christian alternative in the party system is there, then these voters are simply unavailable for the populist right to be taken up. So it's really not, it's mainly a question of availability because they're already associated to a party. However, if, like in the United States, you have this party being taken over by the populist right, then you see a rallying effect. And you can actually see that quite strongly in the United States, that in 2016 you had Evangelicals were the most likely in the Republican coalition to say that they voted Trump primarily because he was a Republican. And because he wasn't Hillary. So the people who voted for Trump initially because they really loved Trump, that were often more secular voters, whereas the Christian right somewhat initially fell behind Trump, fell in line with Trump because they felt he was the lesser of two evils and he was the Republican nominee. And you can also see this vaccination effect that you had in the primaries disappear there. But I think the second and often really underestimated factor is also the behavior of Christian leaders themselves. Because what you can see in Europe is that Christian leaders there often have been extremely outspoken against the populist right. And really, again, I'm just bringing the example of Germany because it's very, very recent in my mind. But there you will have, for instance, the leaders of the Protestant and the Catholic churches really stand up and say, the populist right is not a Christian alternative. They will stand up and say, they demonstrate in front of and protest in front of AfD conferences with slogans like "Our cross is no swastika," and be really outspoken in favor of immigrants and refugees. And as a result of that, they're actually creating they've been able to create quite a powerful social taboo around the populist right, which plays a big role for this vaccination effect. That just, if you are a practicing Christian and you go to church all the time, it often comes with quite high social costs if you are then perceived as being in favor of a populist party. So there's a social taboo that is quite powerful in Germany, but also in France and countries like Italy, Sweden. You can see that throughout the board. Whereas in the United States, that is not quite the religious establishment, to put it in these ways, has not been able to create such a social taboo. And the reason for that, I mean, I don't know whether you want me to go into that right now, but it's a bit more complicated because it's both a lack of willingness to speak out and a lack of abilities to speak out. And I think part of it is actually has something to do also with the structural makeup of the of church-state relations. So in some ways in Europe, it's much easier, for instance, simply to define who is speaking for Christianity with authority. If you have a pope, that makes things easier. If you have a highly institutionalized hierarchical organization, if you have an Archbishop of Canterbury, if you have the Protestant bishops or the head of the Church of Sweden, and these people then say this is the populist right is Christian or is not Christian. It's much easier than the United States, where it's a much more bottom-up approach, where it's not clear. There's nobody who simply through their office can authoritatively speak for Christianity, just because there's so many different denominations and so many of these denominations are decentralized. So it's much harder to speak with authority for Christianity. So that's a bit about the ability to speak out. But then also the willingness to speak out is different, because of the much more bottom-up approach in the United States. Many faith leaders are much more dependent on their also financially on their flock and on donations. And if the congregants are much more sympathetic to the populist right or to some of the ideas, then faith leaders won't be speaking out against that. Whereas if you have a system that is much more hierarchical, as in Europe, it's much easier for faith leaders to speak their mind. And to assume a role of authority is also much more a hierarchical situation in that. And I think that makes it much harder for American faith leaders. One thing that I will stress, though, is that privately, I was quite struck in my interviews that in terms of attitudes of what you might call the even the evangelical establishment in the United States, they were actually similarly critical of the populist right. It's just that they, as I say, they felt they weren't as able speak out against that. But we also shouldn't forget that even with these constraints, a lot of representatives of the American religious establishment actually have spoken out against the populist right. We think of people like Russell Moore, we think of Christianity Today. All of these things have historically been seen as really quite authoritative representations of evangelicalism. But the difference is that they have lost influence as a result of speaking out. So I think this power imbalance between a top-down and bottom-up organization of religion plays a role. But I've talked a lot now. So
yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, it kind of brings the theme how right-wing populists reconcile their emphasis on the one hand preserving the cultural norms and identity of the ethnic majority with increasingly diverse and multicultural societies in which they operate, and question kind of come up about the implications. What implications does it have on minority populations and kind of general social cohesion? So I would wonder, and you discuss here in the book and a number of in a very nuanced way, to what extent does the expectation for minorities to assimilate into the majorities or lead culture reflect the power dynamics which are at play within right-wing identity politics, and how might this impact the broader debate around cultural pluralism or national identity in Western societies?
Yeah, no, I think it's really, really interesting that you bring that up, because if you look at right-wing identity politics, and this is why I also more often actually end up talking about identity politics than populism when I talk about these movements, is that in many ways, you can see in the populist right since the 1990s, say, what a lot of scholars have called an identitarian turn. So in some ways, they have moved away from traditional biological racism and have embraced something that is more, some scholars call it civilizationism, and it's much more what is it called? Sorry, I have a blank. Ethnopluralism. That's the word. Ethnopluralism. That is much less about, as I say, biological racism. It is much more trying to adopt the language and some of the thinking of left-wing identity politics in terms of thinking about rights, group rights, and cultural rights for distinctiveness. But what they are doing is they're trying to really turn around the identity politics of the left by saying they're not defending the rights and identity of ethnic minorities, but they're claiming to do that for the majority population. But the key difference is here, of course, that they thereby also make claims for cultural hegemony within these countries. And it is not and they say part of the rights of an ethnic majority in order to have their cultural identity is that within their country, they can in some ways dictate what cultural identity means, and therefore expect anybody in that country, all the minorities within that country, to assimilate to this idea of national culture, national identity. And I think there's a key difference. So in some ways they're taking a lot of the rhetoric from left-wing identity politics in quite an intelligent way, because they're using the vocabulary and it's in many ways works well, because there's a lot of a very strong crisis of identity, I think, in large parts of the majority population, precisely because you have this erosion of traditional forms of identity, whether it be religious identity or class identity or regional identity. And then in this crisis of identity, they are then confronted with the identity politics of the left in many ways, where minorities claim their rights and their group identity. In many ways, there are some within the majority population who then feel left out because they don't have an identity politics of their own. And it is then right-wing populists that go into this like fear of identity, crisis of identity, also senses of resentment, feeling like they have to go back to the queue. There's the strangers in their own land. And then they try to provide their own form of right-wing identity politics, white identity politics, that is then used to exclude others, and by excluding others, create an identity. And maybe last on that is that this identity is often not a positive identity. It's often an ex negativo identity. And it's thereby also useful to think of right-wing identity politics basically as a triangular worldview between, on the one hand, the us, the good, the pure, and the homogeneous people. But this us is not necessarily defined in quite concrete and positive terms, but rather it is defined in contrast to a set of two others. On the one hand, you have the liberal corrupted elite, that's the internal other, so this like populist dichotomy. And then on the other hand, you have the external other, the external ethnically or religiously other. And what is interesting is that this external other, over the last 20, 30 years, has increasingly been defined in religious and more specifically civilizational terms. And there's a really quite marked increase of the definition of the external other as is Islamic, especially in Europe, but increasingly also in the United States. So I think people like Jose Casanova have shown that quite strongly, the role of Islamophobia in the very definition of Western identity in the rhetoric of the populist right, where he would describe that all of a sudden Turks in Germany were no longer Turks, they were Muslims. Moroccans in France were no longer Moroccans, they were Muslims. And it is only given this religious definition of the other as a Muslim that Christianity then suddenly reappears in the as an analogous cultural identity marker of the us. But what is important is that this is not necessarily a return of religion or religiosity as a matter of faith, but it is really only as a cultural identity marker. In some ways, it's what some scholars have called, Olivier Roy, for instance, it's a zombie religion. It's an empty signifier that is devoid in many ways of Christian beliefs, practices, and institutions. And in some ways, it's a redefinition of the idea of religion itself. In some ways, it's a secularization of religious labels and religious symbols in society, in a society that is much more secular. So perhaps it's also a natural process. But I think recognizing that is an important thing.
Yeah, I have a few more questions before we finish. One would be, given my own research on Russia and Ukraine, Georgia, Serbia, and Eastern Europe in general, I wonder if you noticed external influence in how right-wing populists are operating, whether in terms of funding or some alliances with other external forces, and what kind of alliances are there, if there are any, and if there is any funding or clientelistic practices, if you at all comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at that too closely, but I've obviously got a bit on that from the sidelines just by conducting over 100 interviews with many right-wing populist leaders. And I think one part that is interesting is because it's part of this shift from even nationalism to civilizationalism. So in many ways, the right-wing populists you talk to, they don't necessarily talk about France, the Netherlands, or Germany as much as they talk about Western civilization that needs to be protected. So if you talk to people like Steve Bannon, it's all about Western civilization and the clash of civilizations. And that then allows, to some extent, nationalist international of these movements trying to come together. You had Steve Bannon really trying to bring them together quite structurally with, for instance, at this Academy for the Judeo-Christian West in Frisalti. He had this bit set up as the movement and was trying to create a supranational populist movement across different countries. And there were also some links to especially Russian thinkers and donors. I think that is true and it's important. But I also wouldn't necessarily overestimate it. You could see, first of all, this attempt to bring all the populist movements together didn't really work out particularly well, because the movements just do, in some ways, their own thing, and they do remain structurally nationalist. They're also, as I mentioned, they are unified, but by their opposition to migration, etc., and their right-wing identity politics, but they actually clash on, as I mentioned before, on issues like the economy. They clash on issues like abortion, gay marriage. There's a lot of variation in that. So this project didn't really work. And I would also stress that I think financial part in that isn't that important. I really think that the populist right has been driven much more by the demand side in terms of this new cleavage, this new social cleavage of identity that has really created a very fertile breeding ground for right-wing populist movements. And in many ways, right-wing populist movements are not particularly successful political entrepreneurs. Very often they win in spite of themselves. So I'm often a bit hesitant to overemphasize these influences from say Russian donors or like big organizations that are top down. In my experience, that is actually most of the time quite unsuccessful. And doesn't work particularly well if there isn't already a very strong breeding ground. You can see that with right-wing populist movements. There is in most countries 20 to 30% of the population on average are ready to vote for these movements, and you can often see fluctuation, even one movement being replaced by another, but basically catering to that. So I would emphasize the demand side more strongly than the supply side.
Yeah, it's also what I was just wondering when you were talking about external influences. Are there any examples of religious institutions taking a proactive stance against this phenomenon that you described?
Yeah.
And what are these examples?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in Europe, it's very clear. As I mentioned, in Germany, the churches have been very outspoken, very clearly so, in saying the AfD is not a Christian party. The AfD has also reacted quite strongly. They have called their voters and party members to leave the churches, to renounce their Christian identity. They have said themselves, we are not a Christian party anymore. The churches are just a migration industry, etc. So I think there it's been very clear, clearly established. But you can also see that in countries like the Catholic countries. In France, there's, for instance, been a paper recently which I liked, which was titled "The Pope Francis Effect," where you could see that whenever Pope Francis spoke out in favor of refugees and migration and against right-wing populist rhetoric, you could see the support, only among church-going Catholics, but you could see the support for refugees and migration go up, and the support for the Rassemblement National in France go down. So I think there is still this role authoritative faith leaders can play. And I think throughout Europe, it's really quite overwhelmingly. I'd be much harder pressed to find a country in Western Europe where the churches have been openly in favor of the populist right, than the other way around.
Yeah, can you identify, and this is kind of my last question probably, can you identify any instances where right-wing populist movements in Europe have inadvertently contributed to a resurgence or revitalization of religious practices or beliefs within their respective societies? Was there a kind of an unintended consequence somewhere?
I'm trying to think, but I actually would rather say no, because in many ways, you will see more of a reaction in they have triggered reactions in faith communities, and they might have even contributed to many faith communities in Europe in particular being, I know, more active in their support of migrants. But in many ways, I think the populist right is both a symptom and a harbinger of secularization in our societies. So they are a product of secularization to the extent that secularization has contributed to this crisis of identity in large parts of the majority population, and also to the extent that they have been able to use Christian references and Christian symbols in a way that in some ways contradict the churches. So in some ways, Christian symbols, as a result of secularization, have come up to grasp for in some ways. So you would have them say use traditional theological ideas and say like, oh, love your neighbor is meant geographically. It's all about love your family, maybe love other Germans or other French, but like Syrians, they're really far away. That isn't your neighbor. Which the most theologians I talk to would say like this is not necessarily mainstream thinking, but because of secularization, the churches in many ways have lost that authoritative power, and people who are less religiously literate are often more open to such readings of or such uses of religious references. So I think in that way they are a product of secularization, and they are harbinger of secularization to the extent that using Christian references in such ways obviously also creates a counter-reaction among those who are opposed to the populist right, because many people then identify Christian references and Christian symbols with the populist right, and you will see a lot of people who would identify themselves as left-wing and liberal as saying, oh, therefore religion is bad, because right-wing populists are using that. And I think it's been difficult for many faith leaders to make the case and to reclaim Christian symbols and Christian references from that. But yeah, I don't see much of a resurgence of religion. I would actually argue we are going ever faster down the way of secularization.
And maybe the concluding remarks would be around the question of how might this affect the future of both religious institutions and political movements. And when I say this kind of growing influence of right-wing populism in Europe, and we have this new influx of refugees from Ukraine, one might say they're not the favorite others as compared to the Muslims for the right-wing populists, right, for many reasons. At least in my experience living in Sweden, the Ukrainians were not necessarily conceptualized as the others, as opposed to the Syrians in the rhetoric of the Swedish party. What future effects? We in sociology don't really like futurism, but maybe kind of concluding remarks about the nature of the game.
No. To quote a famous German football player, predictions are always hard, especially when they refer to the future. No, I think a lot of these are, like, as I mentioned, long-term trends. So I think we will see further secularization. We will also see a secularization of the political right. I think in the United States, we will, in the medium to long term, see we will see convergence of right-wing movements, I think, across the Atlantic, but not to the extent that the European right, populist right, will become more religious. But I think we will see a secularization of the American right in many ways. What I'm less sure about is whether the secular right is necessarily going to be more tolerant or less hostile towards minorities. I think in many ways I wouldn't be entirely sure about that. And the question is, I think in the end, what will other political parties do? Will, for instance, progressive parties, liberal parties, will they try to reclaim religious references? I think especially in the United States, it's really interesting. What people often forget, the most religious demographic in the United States are not white evangelicals, but African Americans, Latinos, minorities. They are the people who are more religious and less secular. Whereas the white Christian evangelicals, they're actually becoming less and less religious. There's less and less practice among white evangelical Christians. So I think one question that progressive parties will have to ask themselves: are we going to buy into the right-wing populist claims of religion and right-wing and white goes together, or is there maybe also different, more inclusive religious narrative? I think that would be one big question. And the second one, I think, is for the churches. Will they try to go with the populist right because they're paying lip service to religion and try to get something out of it, have a transactional bargain, like some might argue has happened in the United States?
Or in the Orthodox
or will
world.
they try to reclaim or the Orthodox world? I mean, also to some extent, even some would argue that's the case in Poland, that's the case in Hungary. I think Eastern Europe is a more complicated bit. Brazil is a different issue. It's hard to predict. In Europe, you see some churches stand up to it, but especially if these churches and faith communities are becoming increasingly marginal, are becoming minorities themselves, then the question, will they try to ally with a populist right that is nostalgic, or will they perhaps on the contrary see themselves as one minority among many minorities and become a bit more countercultural, but maybe see themselves rather on the side of Jews and Muslims or other religious minorities, because they're suddenly realizing we are a minority as well. And I think this can produce very different political outcomes. But I think all that is really hard to predict. So
yes. Well, thank you so much, Tobias. As we draw this insightful episode of Religion and Praxis podcast to a close, we want to extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Tobias Cremer for sharing his expertise on the interplay between religion, populism, and right-wing identity politics. We are eager to continue bringing you engaging conversations with leading experts on future episodes of Religion in Praxis. Until then, take care and stay curious.